Hey, everybody. This is the asynchronous little lecture on the problem of the criterion on the first four little sections of book 2 of Sextus's Outlines of Pyrrhonism. So we've talked about the first initial sections of book 1, where Sextus describes to you what Pyrrhonian skepticism is, he thinks. We talked about the 10 modes. Those are some really fascinating arguments. And we talked last time about the 5 modes, these more abstract kind of modes or schema or sort of general rules for generating skeptical arguments. And the problem of the criterion, as it's called primarily in the contemporary scene that we see in book 2, is an application of the 5 modes. And it's one of the more famous vexing problems that survive today. It's a foundational problem. And it's worth seeing the original text where it comes from and thinking hard about it. First, I'll say something briefly about what Sextus talks about at the beginning. So right at the beginning of book 2, in this first section, under the section, can skeptics investigate what the dogmatists talk about? He responds to this little argument you see in that second paragraph. And this argument is a criticism of the skeptical position. This is paragraph 2. They say that skeptics either apprehend what the dogmatists talk about or they do not apprehend it. If they apprehend it, how can they be puzzled about what they say they apprehend? And if they do not apprehend it, then they do not even know how to talk about what they have not apprehended. For just as someone who does not know what, for example, the removal argument or the theorem in 2 complexes is, and you can see the footnote for what those are, those ancient mathematical references, such a person who doesn't understand those can't even say anything about them. So someone who does not recognize any of the items the dogmatists talk about cannot conduct an investigation in opposition to them about the things which he does not know. In neither case, therefore, can the skeptics investigate what the dogmatists talk about. It's a nice little argument against the skeptical position. And what I'm hoping is that this brings to mind a puzzle that Socrates runs about false judgment back in the Theaetetus. It has a very similar structure, if you remember, right? Like, how can you have a false judgment? Because if it's not in your head, how can you make any judgment about it? And if it's in your head, how could you have a false judgment because it's in your head? That's very rough and ready. But remember, that's kind of like the very basic level of that puzzle that Socrates talks about false judgment, and he goes into it in some serious detail, right? But that's like the really big, vague level. I hope that brings to mind and you remember that. And I hope you can see the similarity to the puzzle here, right? The dogmatist says, you skeptics either apprehend what we're talking about or you don't. And if you don't, how can you even be talking to us? And if you do, then what the heck are you skeptical about? Because you say you apprehend it. I hope you see the similarity. And I just want to point to you the kind of answer that Sextus gives, because it shares something in common with the kind of answer that I was suggesting, if you can remember way back from those lectures about the false judgment puzzle, which is that it requires a distinction between kinds of mental apprehensions. And that's exactly what Sextus does over the next several paragraphs, right? Is he gets very clear, and you can appreciate, I hope, like the carefulness of Sextus. Like whether, obviously not all the arguments he gives are equally good. But I hope you really are getting a sense to appreciate like the thoroughness and carefulness with which he's writing. And he goes through some very slow and careful discussion of distinguishing between different senses of apprehending, which is the basic resolution to the puzzle he suggests. So I want to encourage you to look over those paragraphs in this first section and to think about that and to think back to the false judgment puzzle, to see the similarity there and see the extent to which you think here that it works, that Sextus succeeds by distinguishing between these senses of apprehending. But where I want to jump to in this short video is to the problem of the criterion itself. So if you look under the third section, he introduces standards, and you get there a discussion about what the standard of the criterion is. So the basic idea here, by criterion or standard, we mean some mark, some standard, some criterion by which we, you, I, any human, can tell the difference between truth and falsity. How can you tell the difference between truth and falsity? Is there some standard? Is there some mark? Is there some criterion by which you can tell the difference between truth and falsity? In common sense, you think you got one, right? Insofar as you think that some of your beliefs are rational and reasonable and true, and some other people's beliefs are false, or some of your former beliefs are false. Whenever you argue with people, right, you think you're implicitly appealing to some kind of standards in the background about the difference in how you tell the difference between truth and falsity. So this notion of a standard is like implicit in lots of our, it's implicit in our sciences, it's implicit in lots of our common sense discussions. And what you have here is an explicit puzzle about any such standard. And it's a doozy of a puzzle. So we'll flip to 4, the next little section, and this is where this really happens. So let's look at these first few paragraphs real slowly together. Of those who have discussed standards, right, a standard of truth or a criterion of truth, some have asserted that there is one, the Stoics and certain others. Remember when I was giving you that lecture on ancient skepticism? Remember the original kind of big epistemological debate that gave birth to academic skepticism, which is the pre-runner, so to speak, of Pyrrhonian skepticism. Remember, Pyrrhonian skepticism is the break off at the end of the skeptical academy under Philo of Larissa, right? And Nicodemus breaks off from the academy and founds the Pyrrhonian school that Sextus is a part of. But that original academic skepticism, right, that first started when Arcesilaus was elected scholar, that original academic skepticism is all about a debate with the Stoics about their criterion of truth, about their standard of truth. But the Stoics say there is a standard. It's the cataleptic impression, as they call it. And at some points, there are some documents actually where they call it clear and distinct, which is Descartes' later terminology. Descartes was in many ways kind of a Stoic. And the Stoic view is that the sage, the wise person, can learn to tell the difference between when you really have a cataleptic impression and when you don't. And all the arguments between the Stoics and the academics were about whether or not it's possible to really tell, whether it's possible to be in a position where you can really tell that you actually have a cataleptic impression. And the conclusion of the academic arguments is always that you can't, that even the sage will never be able to tell for certain whether they have a cataleptic impression, right? So that's hopefully to jar your memory a little bit about the history that's being referenced here, right? So the Stoics think that they have a criterion of truth. Others, Xenades of Corinth and Xenophanes of Colophon. So Xenophanes was one of the pre-Socratics, right, before Socrates. And Xenophanes says there's no knowledge. There's no criterion of truth. No one can tell the difference between its truth and falsity. Everybody just has belief. It's all belief. It's all equally good. It's all just belief. Or he doesn't say it's all equally, but it's all belief. There's no standard. So there's this debate that some schools, some philosophers in the ancient world have said that there is a criterion of truth. Others have said that they're not. And what do the Stoics say? We suspend judgment. as to whether there's a standard of truth or not. So here's the argument. It's a doozy, like I say. And notice you should be able to see right away that it's an application of the 5 modes. Paragraph 19. Now they will say either that this dispute is decidable or that it is undecidable, right? The dispute about the standard is itself decidable or undecidable. All right, that's exhaustive. If undecidable, they will immediately grant that one must suspend judgment. If decidable, let them say by what it will be judged. When we neither possess an agreed standard nor even know if there is one, but are investigating the matter. So this puzzle really is a specifically unique puzzle about the question about whether there is a standard of truth. Because that question has this weird circularity feature to it, doesn't it? That by asking, is there a standard of truth? To be able to answer that question, you'd already need a standard of truth, wouldn't you? You would need a standard of truth to be able to tell whether or not there's the truth about whether there's a standard of truth. So this puzzle here is kind of unique to this deep, deep, deep bottom level epistemic notion of a standard of truth. That notion seems stuck in a bad problem. If undecidable, I'll read that sentence again and then keep going. If undecidable, they will immediately grant that one must suspend judgment. If decidable, let them say by what it will be judged. When we neither possess an agreed standard and even know if there is one, but are investigating the matter. Again, in order for the dispute that has arisen about standards to be decided, we must possess an agreed standard through which we can judge it. And in order for us to possess an agreed standard, the dispute about standard must already have been decided. That's that circularity problem, right? That if there's a dispute about whether there's a standard of truth, to be able to tell whether that dispute is decidable, you'd have to already have a standard of truth to tell about the truth about the question about whether there's a standard of truth. Thus, the argument falls into the reciprocal mode, right? That's the circularity mode. And the discovery of a standard is blocked, for we do not allow them to assume a standard by hypothesis. You can't just arbitrarily by hypothesis, says Sextus, assert without argument, this is the standard of truth. And if they do want to judge the standard by a standard, we throw them into an infinite regress. So, question, is this the standard of truth or is this discretion? Or even more abstractly, right? Is the debate about the standard of truth itself decidable? Well, you need a standard to decide that, wouldn't you? So it looks like you would need that question to be settled to be able to answer that question. That's the reciprocal mode. Try to get out of the circle. You can just try to assume a standard with no argument. But assumptions don't work. That's just arbitrary. That's the hypothesis mode. And then the dogmatist tries to say, okay, well, maybe there's a meta standard, because that would get you out of the circle, right? Here's the debate about whether there's a standard of truth or not. We could settle that debate by some meta standard of truth. But then you just ask the question again, right? How do you know that meta standard is the right meta standard? Well, you're either going to fall back into a circle or a hypothesis, or you're going to need a meta standard. Infinite regress. Are you starting to see how bad this is? Again, since such a proof needs a standard which has been proven, and a standard needs a proof which has been judged, they are thrown into the reciprocal mode. So the only way to get out of either the infinite regress or the hypothesis would be to fall back into the circle. Those are the paragraphs, and that's the whole problem. So let's make sure we have our heads around the problem, and we can talk about it some when we get back. It is a foundational problem in epistemology. So, question. Is there a way to tell? Is there a criterion that you or I or anybody could use to tell whether there's a standard of truth? Well, looks like that's an open question. If it's an open question, then to settle that question, you would already need a standard to settle the question about whether there's a standard. That's circular. Crap. How do you avoid the circle? Well, maybe you need a meta standard, but then you have the same problem, right? The only way to avoid the circle is to go to an infinite regress of meta standards, standard for a standard for a standard for a standard. But obviously an infinite regress of standards isn't going to work. So avoiding the circle seems like it gets to an infinite regress. And the only way to stop the infinite regress is just to arbitrarily put your foot down and say, this is the standard with no reason. But of course, just asserting things with no reason is irrational. Shit, you're stuck, aren't you? It looks like the question about whether there is a standard of truth or not gets completely hung up on one of these three modes. You're going to be stuck with either giving a circular justification for your standard of truth, or you're going to be stuck with an infinite regress of meta standard and meta standard and meta standard, meta, right? Or you're just going to arbitrarily assert something with no evidence, with no reason. And all three of those look really bad. And not only do all of those look really bad, they're really bad about the most foundational of, perhaps, maybe, right? The most foundational of epistemic questions, which is there a way to tell the difference between truth and falsity? That deepest question that affects everything, seems completely stuck on these three modes. It seems like it's completely stuck of falling into either circularity, infinite regress, or just arbitrary assertion. And none of those look rational. Whoo! That's a doozy of a problem, isn't it? Doozy of a problem. Get your head around that over the Thanksgiving table. I will look forward to seeing everyone back in person on Monday after break. Take care. Bye-bye.